The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. In the frozen, unforgiving grip of the Colorado Rockies, a desperate woman running from a deadly secret collapsed in the deep snow. She expected to die. Instead, she woke up in the cabin of a scarred mountain man who simply told her, "Stay." The San Juan Mountains in the winter of 1881 were no place for the fragile, and they were certainly no place for a woman in a torn calico dress and broken leather boots. The blizzard had blown in fast from the north, a blinding white sheet of ice and fury that erased the horizon and buried the trails. Caleb Montgomery trudged through the knee-deep drifts, his massive frame wrapped in thick buffalo hide. At 38, Caleb was a man carved from the very granite of the peaks he called home. His beard was thick and frosted with ice, and a jagged, pale scar ran down the left side of his face, a permanent reminder of a grizzly bear encounter 5 winters ago. He lived alone near the base of Engineer Mountain, trading furs for flour and coffee down at the Animas Valley Post twice a year. He preferred the silent company of the pines to the treacherous company of men. He was out checking his final trap line before the storm locked the mountain down for good when he saw it. A flash of faded blue fabric, nearly buried under a freshly formed snowbank. Caleb stopped, his heavy snowshoes biting into the crust. He approached cautiously, expecting to find the frozen remains of a lost prospector. Instead, as he brushed away the heavy powder with his thick, leather-gloved hands, he uncovered a woman. She was curled into a tight, desperate ball. Her lips were blue, her skin the color of old parchment, and her dark hair was matted with ice. Caleb pulled his glove off and pressed 2 calloused fingers against her throat. The pulse was there, but it was a fragile, fluttering thing, like the wings of a dying moth. Lord Almighty! Caleb breathed into the howling wind. He didn't hesitate. Caleb scooped her up into his arms, surprised by how light she was, nothing but hollow bones and sheer willpower. He turned his back to the wind and began the brutal 2-mile trek back to his cabin. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed under the dead weight, but he pushed forward. The mountain had taken enough lives. It wasn't going to take hers today. Inside the cabin, the heavy timber walls blocked out the screaming wind. Caleb kicked the door shut, barring it against the storm, and laid the woman gently on his own bed, a thick mattress of pine boughs and bear pelts. He immediately set to work. He stoked the embers in the stone hearth until a roaring fire pushed back the bitter cold. He heated water, soaked rags, and began the agonizing process of slowly warming her frozen limbs. As he worked, he noticed the details the snow had hidden. Her wrists were bruised, wrapped in dark, purple bands that looked distinctly like the marks of a man's heavy grip. There was a fading yellowish contusion on her cheekbone. She hadn't just been lost. She had been running. It took 3 days for the fever to break. 3 days of Caleb forcing warm broth between her chapped lips, wiping the sweat from her brow, and listening to her terrified, delirious mumblings. She cried out for someone named Josiah, begging him to stop, pleading that she didn't take the money. Caleb sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar, listening, and asking no questions of the silent room. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke, leaving brilliant sunshine sparkling on the fresh snow. Olivia Preston opened her eyes. Panic was the first thing she felt. She bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She clutched the heavy wool blanket to her chest, her wide, terrified eyes darting around the unfamiliar, rustic room. The smell of wood smoke, strong coffee, and curing leather filled the air. "Easy there," a deep, gravelly voice rumbled. Olivia flinched, shrinking back against the log wall. A giant of a man stepped out of the shadows near the stove. He was intimidating, with broad shoulders and a scarred face, but his eyes, a striking, clear shade of slate blue, were entirely calm. "You're safe," Caleb said softly, keeping his distance. He poured a cup of coffee into a tin mug and set it on the small wooden table near the bed. "Drink that. It'll warm your blood." Olivia stared at him, her voice trembling. Where am I? Who are you?" "My name's Caleb Montgomery. We're about 20 miles north of Durango, up in the high country. I found you in the snow." He paused, looking at her carefully. "You're lucky to be breathing, ma'am. Olivia hesitated. She remembered the stagecoach wheels snapping on the icy pass. She remembered the driver telling them to wait, but she couldn't wait. If Josiah caught up to her, she was dead. So, she had walked and walked. "Thank you. I don't have any money to pay you." "I didn't ask for any," Caleb replied, his tone flat but not unkind. He turned his back to her, giving her privacy as he threw another log on the fire. "There's stew on the stove. Eat when you're ready. The outhouse is round back. Don't wander far. The snow's deep." Over the next few days, a quiet rhythm established itself in the cabin. Olivia expected the mountain man to demand answers. She expected him to ask why a woman from Denver was wandering the Rockies in late November with nothing but the clothes on her back. She expected the heavy-handed entitlement she was so used to from men like her ex-fiancé, Josiah Webb, a ruthless Denver railroad baron who saw her as nothing more than property to be beaten into submission. But Caleb asked nothing. He chopped wood, checked his traps, and cooked their meals. He treated her with a distant, respectful reverence, as if she were a wounded bird that had flown into his home. When he noticed her flinching if he moved too quickly, he started telegraphing his movements, making sure his heavy footsteps were loud and his hands were always visible. One evening, as Olivia sat by the fire mending a tear in one of Caleb's heavy flannel shirts, she finally broke the silence. "I'm running away," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the needle. Caleb, who was cleaning his Winchester rifle at the table, didn't look up, figured as much. He is a powerful man. In Denver. He'll be looking for me. I shouldn't stay here. I'm putting you in danger." Caleb finally set the oil rag down. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the lingering shadows of fear in her hazel eyes. "The pass is snowed in," he said simply. "Nobody's coming up this mountain until the spring thaw. And even if they do." He picked up the rifle, the metal clicking sharply as he checked the action. "Let him try." He looked back at her. "You heal up. You stay as long as you need to." Winter in the Rockies was a brutal, isolating affair. But inside Caleb Montgomery's cabin, Olivia found something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. As the months bled from December into March, the deep snows kept them trapped in their high-altitude sanctuary. The initial awkwardness between them thawed, replaced by a comfortable, domestic silence. Olivia, desperate to prove she wasn't a burden, took over the cabin's upkeep. She baked sourdough bread from Caleb's supplies, kept the hearth spotless, and learned to skin the rabbits he brought home. In return, Caleb gave her something invaluable: autonomy. He never ordered her around. He never raised his voice. One late afternoon in April, the first real signs of spring began to show. The eaves of the cabin dripped with melting ice. Olivia was outside, taking in the crisp air, when Caleb returned from chopping firewood. He stopped, leaning the heavy double-bitted axe against the chopping block, and watched her. She was smiling, her face turned up toward the pale sun. The bruised, terrified woman he had pulled from the snowbank was gone. In her place was someone resilient, vibrant, and fiercely beautiful. Caleb felt a strange tightening in his chest. It was a feeling he had buried deeply, long ago. He had known love once. 10 years prior, he had brought his young wife, Sarah, out west. She had succumbed to cholera on the trail, dying in agony while Caleb watched, utterly powerless. After that, he had retreated to the mountains, vowing never to let anyone close enough to hollow him out again. Yet, looking at Olivia, he felt the ice around his heart beginning to fracture. "Sun feels good, don't it?" he remarked, stepping up onto the porch. Olivia opened her eyes and smiled at him. "It feels like a promise," she said. She looked at his worn leather gloves. "Your hands must be freezing. Come inside. I've got coffee on." A week later, the lower passes cleared enough for travel. Caleb needed to make the long ride down to Durango to restock their depleted supplies: salt, sugar, ammunition, and coffee. "I'll be gone 2 days, maybe 3, Caleb told her, saddling his massive draft horse, a roan he called Goliath. He handed her a heavy Colt revolver. "You know how to use this now. Keep the door barred at night." "Be careful, Caleb," Olivia said. a knot of genuine anxiety tightening in her stomach. He was her whole world now, the only safety she knew. Down in Durango, the spring thaw had brought a surge of life and filth to the muddy streets. Miners, trappers, and transients flooded the saloons and supply stores. Caleb bought his provisions in silence, keeping his head down. He was loading the heavy sacks onto Goliath when a voice caught his attention. "Worth $500, gold, to anyone who points me to her." Caleb froze. He turned his head slightly toward the boardwalk. Standing outside the saloon was a man in a sharp, tailored city suit that looked entirely out of place in the muddy mining town. He was flanked by two rough-looking hired guns. The man was holding up a hand-drawn poster. "Her name is Olivia Preston." The man, a bounty hunter named Hiram Cole, announced to the small crowd gathering around him. "She is a known thief. Stole $3,000 from a prominent Denver businessman, Josiah Webb. She's dangerous and desperate. Was last seen heading toward the San Juan passes before the winter hit." Caleb's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. A thief. He knew it was a lie. He had seen the bruises. He knew the look of a hunted animal, and it wasn't because of stolen cash. Josiah Webb was using his wealth to put a price on her head, turning every desperate drifter in Colorado into a hound on her trail. "Anyone seen a woman matching this?" Hiram Cole asked, stepping down into the mud. He walked right up to Caleb, eyeing the mountain man's massive frame and the heavy furs. "How about you, mountain man? You look like you wander the high country. See any lost little birds up there in the snow?" Caleb looked at the drawing. It was a good likeness of Olivia. His heart hammered, but his face remained a mask of stone. "I don't see much of anyone up where I trap," Caleb lied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Just bears and wolves. If a city woman wandered up there in November, the coyotes scattered her bones by Christmas." Hiram Cole stared at him, his dark eyes narrowing with suspicion. He looked at the massive amount of supplies Caleb was loading. "That's a lot of flour for one man." "I eat a lot," Caleb replied coldly. He swung up into his saddle, towering over the bounty hunter. "Now step aside." Caleb rode hard. He didn't stop for camp that night, pushing Goliath through the moonlit mountain trails, his mind racing. The isolation of winter was over. The world was coming for Olivia. He reached the cabin just as the sun was breaking over the eastern peaks. Olivia rushed out onto the porch, her face lighting up with relief at the sight of him. But her smile faded the moment she saw his expression. "Caleb? What's wrong?" He dismounted heavily, tying Goliath to the post. He walked up to the porch, his slate blue eyes dark with intensity. "Josiah Webb put a bounty on you," Caleb said bluntly, knowing there was no gentle way to break the news. $500. He's claiming you stole from him. There's a bounty hunter down in Durango named Hiram Cole, asking questions and showing your picture. Olivia's face drained of color. She swayed on her feet, grabbing the porch rail for support. The nightmare she thought she had outrun had just caught up. "No," she whispered, her breathing turning shallow and frantic. No, I didn't steal anything. He wouldn't let me leave. He said if he couldn't have me, he'd see me hang." She spun around, rushing into the cabin. Caleb followed her. She was frantically pulling her few belongings together, a spare shirt, a woolen shawl. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked. "I have to leave," she gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. "If they track you, if they find out you helped me, they'll kill you, Caleb. Hiram Cole is a killer. Josiah hires the worst kind of men. I have to go." Caleb stepped forward and gently but firmly grabbed her wrists, stopping her frantic packing. He looked down into her tear-streaked, terrified face. "You wouldn't make it 10 miles, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a soft, fierce whisper. "I don't care. I won't let them hurt you." "They won't," Caleb said. He let go of her wrists and brought his large, rough hands up to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. The touch sent a shockwave through both of them. It was the first time he had willingly, tenderly touched her since she had healed. "Olivia, listen to me," Caleb said, his eyes locking onto hers. The defensive walls he had built around his heart over the last 10 years shattered completely in that moment. I've spent a decade hiding from the world up on this mountain. I thought I was dead inside until I pulled you out of that snow. You brought life back into this cabin. Back into me." Olivia stared at him, her breath catching in her throat, the panic momentarily forgotten in the wake of his confession. "You don't owe me anything," Caleb continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You never did. But I am telling you now, no bounty hunter and no railroad baron is going to set foot on this mountain and take you from me." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You don't have to run anymore. You don't have to be afraid." He paused, his gaze softening into something deep and unyielding. "Stay. Just stay." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Olivia had finally stopped running, but the shadow of Josiah Webb was stretching far beyond the muddy streets of Denver, creeping up the very slopes of Engineer Mountain. For 3 days following Caleb's return from Durango, the cabin was a fortress of tense anticipation. Caleb didn't speak of sending her away again. Instead, he systematically prepared for war. He cleaned his Winchester 1873 until the brass receiver gleamed, oiled the action of his double-barreled scattergun, and brought in enough chopped wood and water to withstand a month-long siege. Olivia watched him work, the guilt gnawing at her stomach like a starved rat. On the third evening, as the wind began to howl around the timber walls, she couldn't hold it in any longer. "I didn't tell you the whole truth," Olivia said softly, her hands trembling as she set down her mending. Caleb paused in his task of sharpening his heavy hunting knife. He looked up, his slate-blue eyes steady and waiting. He didn't push, he simply let the silence invite her confession. Olivia walked over to her small satchel, the one Caleb had salvaged from the snowbank months ago. With trembling fingers, she unpicked the stitching at the thick leather base, reaching into a hidden lining. She pulled out a small, worn journal, bound in cracked black leather. "Josiah didn't put a bounty on me because I'm a runaway bride, Caleb, and I certainly didn't steal $3,000, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I stole this." She handed the book to him. Caleb wiped his hands on his canvas trousers and took it. He flipped open the pages, his eyes scanning the columns of neat, aggressive handwriting. Names, dates, and massive sums of money were listed with meticulous precision. "Josiah is heavily invested in the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad expansion," Olivia explained, stepping closer to the warmth of the hearth. "He needed land, specifically the parcels running through the southern valleys, but the homesteaders wouldn't sell. So, Josiah hired men to burn them out. When the local magistrates tried to intervene, he bought them. That ledger details every bribe, every hired gun, and every payoff." She pointed to a specific page. "Look there. A $5,000 transfer to an account held by Deputy Marshal Emmett Lang. And there, payments to the clerks of Judge Moses Hallett down in the federal courts to lose the homesteaders' deeds. If this ledger sees the light of day, Josiah Webb doesn't just lose his fortune, he hangs from a federal gallows." Caleb stared at the real, undeniable proof of a railroad baron's bloody empire in his calloused hands. The names were real. The threat was terrifyingly absolute. Hiram Cole wasn't just a bounty hunter looking for a payday. He was an assassin sent to tie up a fatal loose end. "He told me he would burn me alive if I ever breathed a word," Olivia whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "When I found it in his study, I knew I had to get it to the federal marshals in Cheyenne. But his men spotted me boarding the stagecoach. I've been running ever since." Caleb slowly closed the ledger. He didn't look angry. He looked frighteningly calm. The mountain man who traded furs and avoided the affairs of the lower valleys was gone, replaced by a hardened survivor who knew exactly what it took to protect his own. "Then we make sure it gets to Cheyenne," Caleb said flatly. "How?" Olivia cried, her voice cracking. "Hiram Cole is down in Durango. He knows you lied to him. It won't take him long to ask the right bartender where the man with the scarred face traps his furs." "He knows where I trap," Caleb corrected, stepping toward her and placing his heavy hands on her shoulders. "But he doesn't know the mountain. This is my home, Olivia. Up here, A city suit and a silver badge don't mean a damn thing. Up here, the mountain decides who lives. The next morning, Caleb didn't check his trap lines for pelts. He set them for men. He rigged heavy tripwires across the only navigable trail leading up to the ridge. He concealed jawed bear traps beneath the late-season snowdrifts in the blind spots around the cabin. He taught Olivia how to reload the Winchester, standing behind her, his chest pressed against her back, guiding her hands until the motion was fluid and second nature. "If they breach the door, you don't hesitate," Caleb instructed, his breath warm against her ear. "You aim for the center of the chest, and you keep pulling the trigger until the gun clicks empty. Do you understand?" "I understand," she whispered, leaning back into his solid strength, drawing courage from his unyielding presence. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, just as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and crimson, the warning came. A sharp, unnatural crack echoed through the valley. It wasn't a breaking branch. It was the distinct snap of a tripwire snapping a dry pine bough. Caleb instantly extinguished the kerosene lamps, plunging the cabin into heavy shadows illuminated only by the dying embers in the hearth. He grabbed his Winchester and slipped a handful of spare cartridges into his coat pocket. "Stay away from the windows," Caleb ordered, his voice barely a breath. "Bar the door behind me." "Caleb, don't leave me," she pleaded, panic finally clawing at her throat. "I'm not leaving you," he said, turning to cup her face in the dark. He kissed her hard, desperate, and full of a promise that words couldn't hold. "I'm ending it. Lock the door." He slipped out the back window into the freezing dusk. Olivia threw the heavy timber bar across the front door, her hands shaking violently as she gripped the Colt revolver Caleb had left her, retreating to the darkest corner of the room. Outside, the mountain held its breath. Caleb moved like a ghost through the timber line, his white buffalo coat blending with the snow-dusted pines. He crested a ridge overlooking the trail. Below, 4 men advanced. Hiram Cole led the pack, flanked by 2 Durango hired guns and a man wearing the tarnished star of Deputy Marshal Emmett Lang. Josiah Webb had sent the law to ensure his dirty work looked clean. Caleb leveled his Winchester. He exhaled a white plume of breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar shattered the twilight. The heavy bullet took down the lead Durango thug instantly. Chaos erupted. Cole and the remaining men scrambled behind a granite outcrop, firing blindly into the darkening trees. "He's up the ridge," Lang shouted, his voice cracking. He backed away, boots crunching rapidly in the snow, right into the dead zone Caleb had prepared. A metallic snap echoed over the gunfire. The iron jaws of a hidden bear trap slammed shut on Lang's calf. The corrupt deputy's agonizing scream tore through the valley. Realizing he was outmatched in the open woods, Cole made a ruthless calculation. He abandoned the screaming lawman and his remaining hired gun, dropping into the deep brush. He low-crawled, with terrifying speed, circling toward the blind side of the cabin. Inside, Olivia's heart hammered against her ribs, with every gunshot echoing down the mountain. She gripped the heavy Colt revolver, her eyes locked on the barred timber door. Suddenly, the rear window exploded. Glass rained across the floorboards as Hiram Cole hauled himself through the frame. His face was scraped and bleeding, his eyes wild with desperate fury. Olivia shrieked and pulled the trigger. The Colt bucked violently. The bullet grazed Cole's shoulder, spinning him against the iron stove. Before she could cock the hammer again, Cole lunged. He backhanded her viciously across the jaw. Olivia collapsed, the revolver skittering out of reach into the shadows beneath the bed. "Where is it?" Cole spat, grabbing her by the hair and dragging her up. He pressed the cold brass barrel of a derringer tight under her chin. "Where's the ledger, you little thief?" "Go to hell," Olivia choked out, tasting blood. "Webb pays the same if you're dead," Cole snarled, thumbing back the hammer. The heavy timber door didn't just open, it splintered inward off its iron hinges. Caleb stood in the doorway, a towering silhouette against the moonlight, his chest heaving, his face a mask of primal rage. Cole spun, raising the small pistol. But Caleb didn't bother aiming the Winchester. He fired from the hip. The heavy 44-40 slug struck Cole dead center. The bounty hunter was thrown backward by the sheer force, crashing through the wooden table and crumpling lifelessly onto the floorboards. The cabin descended into a ringing silence, broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing. He dropped the rifle and fell to his knees beside Olivia. "Olivia," he gasped, his large hands frantically checking her face, searching for wounds. "Did he shoot you?" "No," she sobbed, throwing her arms around his massive neck, burying her face into his coat. "I'm okay. You came back." "I told you," Caleb whispered, holding her fiercely, anchoring her to the world. "I told you I wasn't letting anyone take you." 2 weeks later, an unassuming, heavily sealed package arrived at the federal courthouse in Denver, addressed directly to the district magistrate. Inside was the black leather ledger, alongside a sworn affidavit detailing the location of Deputy Marshal Emmett Lang's body. The fallout was catastrophic for Josiah Webb. Federal marshals out of Cheyenne raided his Denver estate before he could catch a train east. His railroad contracts were frozen, his empire exposed as a bloody syndicate, and Webb himself was dragged into the street in irons, destined for a federal penitentiary. Up in the high country of the San Juan Mountains, spring finally conquered the brutal winter. The snow melted into rushing crystalline creeks, and the alpine meadows exploded into seas of purple columbine. Caleb Montgomery stood on the porch of his repaired cabin, listening to the wind rustling through the pines. He looked out at the valley, no longer a man hiding from his past, but a man fiercely protecting his future. The door creaked open behind him. Olivia stepped out into the morning sun, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his broad back. Caleb turned, enveloping her in his arms. He looked down at the woman who had fallen into his life from a blizzard, the woman who had brought the spring back to his soul. He didn't need to ask her to stay anymore. This was her home now. Did Caleb and Olivia's fight for survival and justice keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this Wild West romance and want more thrilling, real-life inspired stories of outlaws, courage, and true love against all odds, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this tale with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a wild adventure.